Ryan Carter had everything: power, wealth, and the freedom to choose his own destiny. To him, love was a choice, not an obligation. So when his parents forced him into an arranged marriage with a homeless woman he had never met, he was furious. Determined to prove them wrong, he demanded one private meeting with her, just one chance to reject this ridiculous arrangement and walk away. But when the door to that hotel room opened and he laid eyes on her, everything changed. There was something about her, something that shattered his control and challenged his beliefs in ways he never saw coming. And before he knew it, the man who swore he would never be trapped by tradition found himself trapped by something far more dangerous, an undeniable connection. But was it love, or just a dangerous illusion? And when the world turned against her, would he fight for her, or prove that love was never meant to be theirs? One meeting, one choice, one love that could destroy them both or change their lives forever. Welcome to our channel, where love, betrayal, and redemption come to life through powerful storytelling. If you love emotional love stories filled with suspense, unexpected twists, and heartwarming endings, you're in the right place. To our new viewers, we're so glad you're here. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an unforgettable story. To our returning family, welcome back. Your support means everything, and we can't wait to share more captivating love stories with you. Now sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey of love, heartbreak, and fate that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now, and let's dive into today's incredible story. The city skyline glittered outside the massive glass windows of Ryan Carter's penthouse, a reflection of the empire he had built with his own hands. At just 32, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country, a man whose name was synonymous with success. Yet, despite having everything, wealth, power, and a line of women eager to be in his life, Ryan held firm to one belief: love was a choice, not a contract. He had seen enough of the world to know that money could buy almost anything, but not genuine love. Ryan had grown up watching his parents' traditional marriage, one arranged by their families. Though they had grown to care for each other, their love had always seemed transactional. There was no passion, no spark, just duty and expectation. It was a marriage that worked, but it was not the kind of love Ryan wanted. He wanted love that was raw, unpredictable, and undeniable. He wanted the kind of love that made a man lose himself, that made his heart race, and that consumed him entirely. So, when his parents suggested, no, insisted, that he agree to an arranged marriage, he laughed. "Are you serious?" Ryan leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. "This is not the 18th century, Mum. I choose who I marry." His mother, Eleanor Carter, was not amused. A regal woman with sharp eyes and a mind just as sharp, she sighed as she sat across from him in his lavish home. "Ryan, you're not getting any younger," she said. "And love? Love is not what you think it is. It's not some magical thing that happens in fairy tales. Love is built with time, understanding, and the right partner." His father, Thomas Carter, who had built their family's name in the business world long before Ryan took over, nodded in agreement. "You're too busy to find love, son. We've found the perfect match for you." Ryan scoffed. Perfect match? Based on what? A checklist? Compatibility scores? His mother's lips curled into a small smile. "Something like that. She's different from anyone you've ever met." His interest was mildly piqued, but he still shook his head. "Not interested. I'll marry for love, or I won't marry at all." His mother exchanged a glance with his father before she spoke again. "Her name is Aisha." Something about the way she said the name made Ryan pause. It wasn't just a name. It carried weight, a hidden meaning he didn't understand yet. "She's not from our world," his mother continued. "She's homeless, Ryan's sharp blue eyes narrowed. Homeless? She's had a difficult life, his father admitted, but she's beautiful, she's strong, and she has a heart that money can't buy. Ryan almost laughed again. This had to be a joke. His billionaire parents, who prided themselves on their elite social circles, wanted him to marry a woman who had no home, no status, no wealth. Why? Ryan asked, voice laced with disbelief. Why would you even consider this? His mother's voice softened. Because sometimes love is not found where you expect it, and because we believe she might be exactly what you need. Ryan leaned forward, studying their faces. There was no hesitation, no manipulation, just certainty. They genuinely believed this was a good idea. He exhaled slowly, his mind working through the absurdity of it all. There was no way he was agreeing to this, but curiosity gnawed at him, an unfamiliar restlessness settled. Ryan Carter prided himself on being a man in control of his life. Every decision he made, whether in business or personal matters, was calculated, logical, and deliberate. Love, to him, was no different. He had spent years rejecting shallow relationships with women who only saw his wealth and name. If he ever married, it would be on his terms. But tonight, as he sat in his parents' grand estate, he realized that control was slipping from his grasp. Marry her, Ryan? The words echoed in the lavish dining hall, the glow of the crystal chandelier reflecting in the wine glass he had just set down. Ryan blinked, certain he had misheard. "Excuse me?" He let out a sharp chuckle, looking between his mother and father. "Did you just say, marry her?" His mother, Eleanor Carter, sat composed, sipping her tea as if she had just suggested something as simple as a weekend getaway. "Yes, we've already made arrangements." Ryan's father, Thomas Carter, nodded. "She's the perfect choice." Ryan leaned back, folding his arms over his chest. "And who exactly is this perfect choice you've decided on without me?" There was a brief pause before his mother answered. "Her name is Aisha." A name again, a name that held weight, yet no meaning to him. "And?" Ryan arched a brow, waiting for more. "She's a beautiful young woman, kind-hearted and strong," his mother continued. "But—" She hesitated. Ryan narrowed his eyes. "But what?" "She's homeless," his father said, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. Silence. Ryan stilled. For a moment he thought they were joking, but the serious expressions on their faces told him otherwise. And then he laughed, a short, incredulous laugh that echoed in the spacious room. "A homeless girl?" he smirked. "You expect me, a billionaire, to marry a girl with no home, no money, no background? What next? Should I give up my company and start begging on the streets with her?" His mother's eyes remained steady. "This is not a joke, Ryan." "Oh, I assure you, I know," he scoffed, "because if it were, it would be a terrible one." Ryan pushed back from the table and stood, pacing near the fireplace. His entire life had been carefully built around power, wealth, and control. He had fought to rise to the top, to build an empire from nothing. Now his own parents wanted him to throw it all away for a girl who had nothing. "Why?" he demanded, turning back to them. "Why would you even consider something so absurd?" His father exhaled slowly. "Because she's not just some girl. She's different, Ryan. She has a strength that no amount of money can buy." "Strength?" Ryan let out a dry laugh. "Strength doesn't pay bills, Dad. Strength doesn't get you through high society events or business meetings. What do you expect me to do? Walk into a gala with a wife who doesn't even have a permanent address?" His mother's gaze softened. "You think love is about power and status. But true love, Ryan, isn't found in riches. It's found in the heart." Ryan clenched his jaw. His mother had always been a romantic, but this wasn't about love, this was madness. "Tell me something," Ryan said, his voice controlled but sharp. If she's so strong, so perfect, why is she homeless? His parents exchanged a glance, and for the first time, he saw something else in their expressions. Pity. She's had a hard life, his father admitted. She lost her family at a young age. She's had no one. Ryan felt something stir in his chest, something unfamiliar. He ignored it. Why would she even agree to this? He asked instead. Because she needs a chance, his mother answered. And you need someone who will love you for who you are, not for your money. Ryan clenched his fists. He wasn't sure what infuriated him more, the fact that they thought they knew what he needed, or the fact that a small part of him was curious about this girl. This is insane, he muttered. I'm not marrying a woman I don't know, especially not like this. His father sighed. Then meet her, Ryan. One meeting, that's all we ask. Ryan hesitated. He had already made up his mind to reject this ridiculous idea. But something about his parents' confidence unsettled him. They were convinced this girl, this complete stranger, was meant for him. And then, out of sheer arrogance, out of a need to prove them wrong, he smirked. Fine, he said. One meeting, alone. I'll see for myself how perfect she is. His mother smiled slightly, as if she had already won. Then it settled. But Ryan didn't see it that way. To him, this wasn't the beginning of a love story. This was a challenge, and he never backed down from a challenge. The Carter mansion was silent, yet tension buzzed in the air. Ryan Carter leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand, his piercing blue eyes locked on his parents. They had thrown an absurd proposal at him, marriage to a homeless girl, and they expected him to comply without question. But Ryan Carter never did anything without control. I'm not a fool, Ryan said, setting the glass down on the table with a soft clink. If you think I'm going to marry a complete stranger just because you believe she's different, you're wrong. His father, Thomas Carter, sighed. Ryan held up a hand. I'll consider meeting her, but under my terms. His mother, Eleanor, arched a brow. And what terms are those? Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. One private meeting, no family, no outside influence, just me and her, alone. His mother's lips pressed together, and his father's brows furrowed. A private meeting, his father repeated, wary. Yes, Ryan confirmed, in a neutral place, a hotel. His mother's breath hitched. Ryan, that's inappropriate. Ryan smirked. Is it? I need to know who she really is, not the version you've painted for me. If I'm expected to marry her, I should at least see what I'm dealing with. And let's be honest, Mother. If she's as innocent as you claim, then there's nothing to worry about, right? Eleanor shot her husband a glance, uncertain. This isn't how things are done, Ryan. Ryan crossed his arms, a silent dare in his eyes. Then consider the marriage off. Silence. Finally, his father exhaled, shaking his head. Fine. One meeting. But Ryan, don't treat this like one of your business deals. She's not a contract to negotiate. Ryan stood, adjusting his suit jacket. Trust me, Dad. I already know how this will end. But the truth was, he didn't. The next morning, arrangements were made. Ryan instructed his assistant to book a luxury hotel suite, somewhere discreet, yet elegant. If he was going to meet this girl, it would be on his terms, his territory. He imagined the meeting to be predictable. A shy, desperate girl, eager to please him, maybe even grateful for the opportunity to marry a billionaire. He had seen it before, women throwing themselves at him, their eyes filled with dreams of wealth, luxury, and security. This girl would be no different, or so he thought. As evening fell, Ryan arrived at the hotel first. The suite was dimly lit with soft golden lights, the scent of fresh roses lingering in the air. He poured himself a drink, standing by the window, waiting. Then there was a knock. He smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. Showtime. He walked over and opened the door. And there she was. Aisha. Ryan expected, well, he wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. Aisha stood before him, her deep brown eyes locked onto his with quiet confidence. She was breathtaking in the simplest way, a natural beauty untouched by artificial enhancements. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that was both delicate and strong. Her rich brown skin glowed under the dim lighting, her posture straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She wasn't wearing expensive designer clothes, just a simple dress that hugged her figure modestly, yet there was an elegance about her that money couldn't buy. Ryan, for the first time in years, was momentarily speechless. Aisha, however, remained unaffected. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her voice smooth and steady. "May I come in?" Ryan stepped aside, watching as she walked past him into the suite. He expected her to be nervous, to fidget, to stumble over her words. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Would you like something to drink?" Ryan asked, his voice coming out smoother than he intended. "No, thank you," she replied, her tone polite but distant. She wasn't awestruck by his wealth. She wasn't desperately trying to impress him. She wasn't what he had imagined at all. Intriguing. Ryan took a seat across from her, studying her closely. "You know why we're here," she nodded. "Your parents want us to marry. You don't." Ryan tilted his head. "And you? What do you want?" Aisha hesitated. "A chance." Ryan's brows furrowed slightly. "A chance at what?" "To prove that I'm not just some homeless girl you think I am," she said, meeting his gaze head-on. Ryan let out a short chuckle. "You're bold." Aisha shrugged. "I have to be. Life didn't give me the luxury of being soft." Something in her words stirred an unfamiliar emotion in him. He had met countless women, yet none had spoken to him like this. "So, tell me," Ryan leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, "what makes you think you belong in my world?" Aisha didn't flinch. "I don't. But I also don't believe you belong in mine." Silence stretched between them. Ryan should have been irritated. He should have laughed in her face. But instead he found himself intrigued. Aisha wasn't playing a game. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply being herself. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't going to be the predictable meeting he had expected. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, something thrilling, something that just might change everything. Ryan Carter had faced many surprises in his life. Business deals that flipped overnight, stocks that soared unexpectedly, and rivals who turned into allies. But none of them prepared him for the sight that stood before him now. Aisha. The moment he opened the hotel suite door, his breath caught in his throat. She was nothing like he had imagined. Ryan expected someone timid, fragile, maybe even desperate. But Aisha was none of those things. She stood there, poised, her deep brown eyes locking onto his, with an intensity that shook him. They weren't just beautiful. They held a story, one filled with pain, strength, and resilience. He could tell she had lived through storms he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Her long, dark hair cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders, framing a face so naturally stunning it felt almost unreal. And her body, graceful yet strong, curves that were effortlessly alluring, yet carried themselves with dignity. Ryan had seen countless beautiful women before, but none had made his heart race like this. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ryan was caught between disbelief and fascination, while Aisha remained composed. "Are you going to let me in?" she finally asked, her voice smooth, confident. Ryan blinked, realizing he had been staring. He stepped aside without a word, watching as she walked past him into the suite. There was something about her presence, something that made the air around them feel charged, powerful, unpredictable, dangerous. Ryan closed the door and turned to face her. He wasn't used to feeling off balance, but Aisha was unsettling him in ways he didn't understand. He expected her to admire the luxurious suite, to be in awe of the five-star comfort. Most women would be. But she didn't even glance at the elegant furnishings or the city skyline view. Instead, she turned and faced him, waiting. He liked control. He liked being the one to dictate the pace. But she had just shifted the power dynamic, and that intrigued him. He smirked slightly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I assume my parents have told you why you're here." Aisha nodded. "They want us to marry." "And you're fine with that?" he challenged. She didn't hesitate. "Are you?" Ryan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. This woman was different. Ryan walked toward the bar, pouring himself a drink. He needed something to distract himself from the way her presence was affecting him. As he turned back, his gaze lingered on her eyes again. Those eyes, they were haunting, beautiful, yet holding shadows of things she had never spoken about. Pain, loss, loneliness. She had been through something that made her wary, strong, guarded, and yet she wasn't afraid of him. Ryan had never met a woman who didn't try to impress him, but Aisha didn't seem interested in doing that. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth, nor was she throwing herself at him. She was a mystery, and Ryan hated mysteries he couldn't solve. Ryan took a slow sip of his drink. "You're different from what I expected." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "And what did you expect?" He chuckled softly. "A girl who would be eager to please, desperate for a billionaire to save her." Aisha didn't flinch. "I don't need saving, Mr. Carter." Something stirred deep in Ryan's chest. "You live on the streets," he pointed out, studying her reaction. Aisha met his gaze without hesitation. "And yet, I still have more freedom than you." That caught him off guard. He set his drink down, stepping closer. "Is that so?" Aisha nodded. "Your wealth, your status, it controls you, but me, I have nothing to lose." God. Ryan wasn't sure if he was irritated or intrigued, but one thing was certain. He wanted to know more. Ryan wasn't sure when it happened, but suddenly the space between them had closed. The air felt heavier, electric. He studied the curve of her lips, the way her breath was steady, despite the tension between them. She wasn't unaffected. She was just better at hiding it. He smirked, leaning slightly closer. "So, tell me, Aisha, why would a girl like you agree to marry a man like me?" Aisha held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because I don't believe in fairy tales," she said softly. "And neither do you." Ryan exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside him. This wasn't just a meeting. This was the beginning of something dangerous, something neither of them could control. Ryan Carter had seen power in many forms. In boardrooms, where men with billions at stake held their breaths. In negotiations, where a single signature could change the course of industries. In rivals who fought tooth and nail to dethrone him. But he had never seen this kind of power before. One that didn't come from wealth or influence, but from something deeper. From survival. And it belonged to the woman standing before him. Aisha's posture remained unshaken, her deep brown eyes steady as she looked at him. Not with admiration, not with desperation, but with something else entirely. Indifference. Ryan wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to people, not women at least, standing before him without some kind of expectation in their gaze. Yet here she was, homeless, alone, without a safety net. And still she didn't beg. She didn't plead for his approval. She simply existed. with a quiet strength that unsettled him. "If you don't want this marriage," she said, her voice calm but firm, "say no." Ryan's brows lifted slightly. "Just like that?" Aisha nodded. "I have survived worse." Survived worse. The weight of those words lingered in the air between them. Most women in her situation would have jumped at the chance to marry a billionaire. They would have smiled sweetly, tried to impress him, played whatever role they needed to secure a future of luxury. But Aisha, she didn't even seem to care. She was prepared to walk away. Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't seem very invested in this." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "And you do?" Ryan smirked. "I was forced into this, just like you." Aisha's lips curved into a faint, almost knowing smile. "Then we have something in common." Ryan studied her carefully. "You're not scared, are you?" "Of you?" she asked, amusement flickering in her gaze. "No." He should have been insulted. Instead, he was intrigued. Ryan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Most women would see this as a golden opportunity. Aisha remained unfazed. "Then I suppose I'm not most women." Ryan let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "No, you're not." She didn't fight for his acceptance. She didn't try to convince him to want her. She simply made it clear her worth wasn't defined by whether or not he said yes. And that was the most powerful thing of all. Ryan could feel it now. The shift. He had walked into this meeting fully expecting to reject her, to put an end to this absurd arrangement and walk away. But now he wasn't so sure. He didn't like things he couldn't control. And Aisha? She was completely out of his control. And that made her dangerous, and dangerously irresistible. Ryan Carter had stepped into this meeting with the sole intention of testing Aisha. He wanted to see if she would flinch, if she would be desperate, if she would try to impress him. He wanted a reason, any reason, to prove that this forced engagement was ridiculous. But now he was the one being tested, and he was failing. Ryan leaned back against the plush leather couch, watching Aisha with narrowed eyes. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She hadn't even tried. Yet, he couldn't look away. There was something about the way she sat across from him, poised yet relaxed, completely unfazed by the power he wielded. She didn't cower. She didn't shrink. She existed in her own world, on her own terms. And that was intoxicating. At first, he had been struck by her beauty. The deep brown of her eyes, the way her hair framed her face, the graceful curves of her figure. But now, it was more than that. It was the way she spoke, the way she challenged him with her words, never backing down. The way she seemed so sure of herself, even when life had given her nothing. "How long have you been living on the streets?" he asked, genuinely curious now. Aisha met his gaze evenly. "Long enough to know that survival isn't about strength. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Ryan tilted his head slightly. "And what are you doing now?" Her lips curled slightly. "Deciding." Ryan felt a strange pull in his chest. This woman was impossible, and he liked it. Ryan wasn't sure when the atmosphere changed. One moment it was a conversation, a test of wills, a battle of words. The next, it was something else entirely. Something heavier, something neither of them could ignore. Ryan was used to control. He dictated the flow of business meetings, the terms of negotiations, the outcome of every situation in his life. But sitting here, across from a woman who had nothing and yet held herself like a queen, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't in control anymore. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You fascinate me, Aisha." She raised an eyebrow. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Ryan smirked. I haven't decided yet. Aisha's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Good, because I haven't decided about you either. Damn. Ryan had met hundreds of women, models, heiresses, CEOs, actresses, women who knew how to play the game, women who knew what to say, how to act, how to manipulate charm to their advantage. But Aisha, she wasn't playing any games, and yet she was winning. For the first time in years, Ryan felt something unexpected. Intrigue, genuine, bone-deep intrigue. She was fearless, intelligent, beautiful, and completely unimpressed by his wealth. And God help him, but he was drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time, the idea of marriage, this marriage, didn't seem as absurd as it had just an hour ago. And that realization, it was dangerous, because Ryan Carter never let anyone shake his world. But Aisha, she had done it effortlessly. Ryan Carter was a man of discipline. He built his empire by mastering control of his business, his emotions, and every aspect of his life. Nothing and no one ever made him lose himself. But Aisha, she was undoing him, and she wasn't even trying. Ryan had never been uncertain before. He always knew exactly what he wanted, exactly how to act. Yet sitting here in this quiet hotel suite, staring into Aisha's deep brown eyes, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Something stirred in his chest, something foreign, something dangerous, desire. Not the fleeting kind he had felt for beautiful women before, not the kind that came with attraction, with lust, with momentary passion. This was different. Aisha sat there, her expression unreadable, but her presence, it was unshakable. Ryan had expected nervousness, anticipation, maybe even a flicker of hesitation. But she didn't move. She didn't flutter her lashes or look away. She simply waited. Not for him, but for his choice. And that was what made her so damn irresistible. Ryan exhaled, his fingers flexing against his knee. He should have looked away. He should have ended this conversation and walked out. But instead he leaned forward. Not too much. Just enough to catch the slight shift in her breathing, just enough to feel the heat between them, just enough to make this dangerous. He studied her, his eyes tracing the soft curves of her lips, the graceful line of her neck, the steady rise and fall of her chest. She wasn't just beautiful, she was a force. And for the first time in his life, Ryan felt like he was losing control. "Tell me something, Aisha," he said, his voice lower now, rougher. She tilted her head slightly. "What?" Ryan swallowed, his gaze locked on hers. "Are you afraid of me?" Aisha didn't even blink. Should I be? God. He didn't know if he wanted to laugh or kiss her. Maybe both. His hand twitched, itching to reach out, to touch her, to feel if the warmth of her skin matched the fire in her eyes. But he couldn't. He shouldn't. This wasn't supposed to happen. Yet, here he was, falling into a moment that wasn't meant to exist. A moment of weakness. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Carter didn't want to fight it. Ryan Carter was a man who had always been in control. Every business deal, every stock investment, every aspect of his life was precisely calculated. There was no room for emotions, no room for unpredictable impulses. But sitting here, in this dimly lit hotel suite, staring at the woman he was supposed to reject, nothing felt calculated anymore. Nothing made sense. And yet, everything felt dangerously right. Aisha sat across from him, her hands resting delicately on her lap. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't playing the role of an eager bride-to-be. She wasn't saying the things she was supposed to say, and that made her infinitely more intriguing. Ryan studied her, the way her deep brown eyes held his without hesitation. The way her smooth skin seemed to glow even in the dim lighting. She was breathtaking, but it wasn't just her beauty that drew him in. It was the quiet strength in her posture, the way she didn't shrink under his gaze, the way she owned the space she occupied, even though she had nothing. How could someone who had lost everything still look so unbreakable? Ryan wanted to understand her, but more than that, he wanted to feel her. Without thinking, Ryan reached forward. His fingers brushed against hers, hesitantly at first, just a whisper of a touch. Aisha could have pulled away. She could have looked at him with wide, startled eyes. She could have recoiled, could have reminded him that they were nothing more than strangers forced into this situation. But she didn't. Instead, she looked into his eyes. And in that single look, Ryan felt it. The shift. The undeniable pull that neither of them could ignore. Slowly, deliberately, Ryan's fingers curled around hers, wrapping her delicate hand in his much larger one. Aisha inhaled sharply, not in fear, not in discomfort, but in something else entirely. Something just as dangerous as what he was feeling. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was thick with electricity. Ryan had never experienced this before, not with any woman. There had been passion before, desire, fleeting attraction. But this was something more. This was a war of restraint, a battle between logic and impulse, and Ryan was losing. His thumb brushed against the soft skin of her palm, tracing slow circles that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. Aisha's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came, because words wouldn't be enough. Not for this. Ryan tried to fight it, tried to remind himself that this was just a test, that this was supposed to be a formality before he rejected this entire ridiculous proposal. But his body wasn't listening. His heart was betraying him, slamming against his ribs like a caged animal, and his mind was filled with her, the warmth of her skin, the slight tremble in her fingers. Not from fear, but from something else. From an attraction she wasn't expecting, from a connection she wasn't prepared for, just like him. Ryan swallowed hard. His grip on her hand tightened ever so slightly. Aisha didn't pull away, didn't break eye contact, and in that moment, Ryan knew she felt it too. She might not have wanted this marriage. She might have walked into this room prepared to reject him, just like he was prepared to reject her. But this moment changed everything, because now there was hesitation. Now there was doubt. Now there was something real. Ryan wasn't afraid of much. He had faced ruthless competitors, dealt with multi-million-dollar losses, survived betrayals in the business world that would have destroyed weaker men. But this terrified him, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could control himself. His free hand twitched, aching to reach out, to brush a strand of hair from her face, to touch her in a way that would break every rule of this arranged meeting. His breath was uneven now, his heartbeat out of sync with the calm, composed businessman he had always been. And Aisha? She wasn't helping. She sat there, her own breathing shallow, her own emotions betraying her cool exterior. She wasn't pushing him away, she wasn't demanding space. She was waiting for him to decide what this moment meant, waiting for him to make the next move. And that was the most dangerous thing of all, because Ryan Carter never hesitated, never doubted, never let emotions interfere with logic. But tonight, with her, he was about to break his own rules. Ryan leaned in slightly, just enough to catch the faint scent of her, a mixture of rain and something soft, something he couldn't quite place. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. Aisha. Her lips parted. Ryan. Just a name, just a whisper. But it was enough. Enough to make him want to forget everything else. Enough to make him wonder if, just this once, he could allow himself to fall. Enough to make him realize that whatever this was between them, it wasn't just attraction anymore. It was something deeper, something neither of them had been prepared for, something neither of them could ignore. And Ryan, he wasn't sure he wanted to fight it anymore. The moment between them shattered like fragile glass. Just when Ryan felt himself being pulled deeper, just when his grip on Aisha's hand tightened with silent urgency, she pulled away. Her warmth disappeared from his fingers, leaving behind only an aching emptiness. Ryan frowned, his pulse still racing, his body still thrumming with the tension of what had just happened between them. Aisha, however, had retreated. Not physically. She still sat before him, still held his gaze, but something in her changed. She closed off, as if a wall had suddenly shot up between them, and Ryan, he hated it. "You're used to getting what you want," Aisha murmured, her voice soft but unyielding. Ryan stilled. It wasn't an insult, it wasn't a challenge. It was a truth. He was a billionaire, a man of power, a man who never had to beg, never had to struggle, never had to fight for the right to simply exist. Everything he wanted he took, everything he touched he owned. But love wasn't about power. And Aisha. She had learned that lesson in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. Ryan watched as she took a slow, steadying breath, her fingers curling into fists against the fabric of her dress. "I had a family once," she whispered. A silence heavier than before settled between them. A silence filled with ghosts. Ryan's chest tightened, his earlier frustration disappearing, replaced by something deeper, something unfamiliar, something that felt uncomfortably close to concern. He didn't speak, didn't push, because the look in her eyes told him this wasn't a story she had ever wanted to tell, but tonight she did. Aisha swallowed hard, as if preparing herself for the pain that came with reliving the past. "I was 10 when I lost my parents," she said. Ryan's stomach clenched. He hadn't expected that. She exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening on her lap. "They died in a car accident. It was sudden. One minute we were driving home from the market. The next, everything was gone." Her voice was even, but Ryan saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, a pain that had never truly faded. Ryan had dealt with loss before. He had lost business partners, lost money, lost trust in people who had betrayed him. But he had never lost family, never lost the foundation of what made life worth living. She had. And the weight of it still lingered in her words, in her silence, in the guarded way she held herself. "The accident left me alone," Aisha continued, staring at her hands. "I had no one, no relatives willing to take me in, no home to return to." Ryan didn't realize he was holding his breath. "I was sent to an orphanage," she said. "It wasn't a bad place, but no one ever picked me." Her voice wavered slightly, but she quickly steadied it. "I waited for years," she admitted. "Waited for a family to want me, to love me." Ryan felt something sharp twist in his chest. "But that never happened," Aisha finished, her eyes dark with an old, familiar acceptance. Ryan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. How could someone like her, so strong, so graceful, have been left alone in this world? How could no one have seen her worth? "I left the orphanage when I turned 18, she said, "with nothing but a few clothes and a promise that I'd make it on my own." Ryan wanted to ask what happened next, but a part of him already knew. She had struggled. She had faced the world with nothing but sheer will, and the scars of that fight were still on her, maybe not visible, Maybe not on her skin, but inside. In the way she refused to beg, in the way she refused to need anyone. Ryan had met countless women in his life, women who wanted his wealth, his influence, his name. But Aisha, she only wanted to survive. And that realization made his stomach tighten with something that felt dangerously close to admiration. "I've lived a life you can't understand, Ryan," Aisha murmured, looking up at him. Her eyes, those deep brown eyes that had hypnotized him moments ago, were filled with raw truth. "I've spent years learning to survive without love." Ryan swallowed. She wasn't saying this to make him feel guilty. She wasn't asking for pity. She was simply stating a fact that tore through him in ways he hadn't expected. "You think love is about desire," Aisha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "About wanting someone and taking them. But for me, love was never an option. It was never a choice." Ryan felt his chest tighten, because for the first time he understood. He understood why she was so different, why she carried herself with such quiet strength, why she wasn't impressed by his wealth, his power, his presence. She had never had the luxury of love. She had never needed it to survive. For the first time in his life, Ryan didn't know what to say. He had built his world on certainty, on knowing exactly what people wanted from him. But Aisha, she didn't want anything from him. Not his money, not his pity, not even his affection. And that should have been a relief. It should have made walking away easier. But instead, it made him want to stay. Because now, Ryan Carter wasn't just intrigued by Aisha. He wasn't just attracted to her. He wanted to understand her, wanted to break through the walls she had spent a lifetime building, wanted to give her something she had never believed in. A love that wasn't about power. A love that was real. And for the first time, Ryan wasn't sure if he was the one in control anymore, because Aisha wasn't just a woman he had been forced to meet. She was the one woman who could undo him. And she already had. Ryan Carter had spent his entire life believing he was immune to emotions. He had built his empire on logic, on calculated risks, on decisions that served his best interests. Love was just a fleeting emotion, a weakness, a luxury for those who didn't have everything to lose. But as he sat there staring at Aisha, the woman his parents had forced into his life, he felt something shift inside him, something dangerous, something real. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking, he was feeling. Ryan had met countless beautiful women, models, actresses, women with wealth, with power, with influence, but none of them had looked at him the way Aisha did. She wasn't awed by his status. She wasn't charmed by his wealth. She wasn't trying to impress him. And that made her more captivating than anyone he had ever known. Her deep brown eyes held stories he couldn't even begin to understand. Her soft, full lips had spoken words that unraveled him. Her body, elegant, delicate and breathtaking, wasn't what trapped him. It was her strength, her refusal to bend, her ability to look at him, not as a billionaire, but as just a man. Ryan had always been in control, but tonight, for the first time, he felt helpless. Not because he was afraid of losing her, he barely knew her. Not because he wanted her physically, he wanted more than that. He wanted to understand her, to know her pain, her fears, her dreams. And that realization was more terrifying than anything he had ever faced in business, because this wasn't a game. This wasn't something he could buy. This wasn't a deal he could negotiate. This was Aisha, and she was unlike anyone he had ever met. Ryan didn't believe in fairy tales. He didn't believe in love at first sight. But right now, as he sat across from Aisha, his entire body tensed with a feeling he couldn't name. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just admiration. It was an aching need to protect her, to shield her from the world that had been so cruel to her, to give her the security she had never known, to erase the pain in her eyes and replace it with something he had never given any woman before: trust. Ryan clenched his fists, trying to fight the war raging inside him. Why was she the one undoing him? Why did her pain feel like his own? He had met people who had suffered before, had done business with ruthless men who clawed their way out of the dirt to survive. But this was different, because when he looked at Aisha, he didn't see a woman who needed saving. He saw a woman who had already saved herself. And that made him want her even more. Not as a conquest, not as a prize, but as a partner, as someone he couldn't afford to lose. She wasn't fragile, she wasn't weak, and she sure as hell wasn't waiting for him to fix her. Aisha had already fought her battles, already built her armor, already accepted that the world would never give her the love she deserved, and yet, here she was, sitting across from a man she had no reason to trust, opening up a part of herself that no one had ever seen. That was bravery. And Ryan Carter had never respected anyone more. Ryan's entire life had been built on caution, on never making a move unless he knew he would win. But this was the riskiest thing he had ever faced, because if he let himself fall for her, there would be no turning back. He couldn't lose control, he couldn't want her. But damn it, he did. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could fight it anymore. The air between them was thick with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Aisha was staring at him, her gaze soft but unreadable. Ryan wanted to say something, wanted to tell her that he understood now, that he saw her. Not just her beauty, but everything she had been through. That he wasn't just sitting here as a man forced into this meeting, that he was sitting here as a man who had just found something worth fighting for. But instead, all he said was, Aisha. Just her name, a whisper, a promise, and the moment stretched between them, undeniable, unshakable, and completely out of his control. Ryan Carter had never believed in love before, but tonight he wasn't so sure anymore. Ryan Carter had walked into the hotel room with one goal: to prove to his parents that this arranged marriage was a mistake. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that no woman, no matter how beautiful or intriguing, could make him question his belief in love. And yet, he walked out a different man. His world, once predictable and meticulously controlled, had been thrown into chaos. He had expected to feel nothing for Aisha, expected to walk away and reject this marriage without a second thought. But now he wasn't sure anymore. Ryan sat in the back seat of his luxury car, the city lights flashing past as his driver navigated through the streets. His mind was a storm. He could still hear her voice, the way she had spoken with quiet strength, could still see the pain in her eyes, the years of struggle she had endured, and worst of all, he could still feel the warmth of her hand in his. His fingers twitched against his knee as if trying to recall the sensation. It wasn't just attraction, it wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, and that terrified him. Ryan leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes. Was this guilt? Did he only feel this way because he pitied her? Because he had seen a side of life he had never experienced? Because he had everything while she had nothing? Number. It wasn't just guilt. It was admiration, respect, something dangerously close to need. But that didn't mean he could call it love. Not yet. By the time Ryan arrived home, his decision was made. He couldn't say no to the marriage. But was he truly saying yes? His parents were waiting for him in the grand living room of their estate, their faces filled with hope. "Well?" his mother asked, barely able to contain her excitement. Ryan hesitated for only a second before nodding. I'll marry her." The words left his lips before he could take them back, and just like that, his fate was sealed. His father clapped him on the back, beaming with pride. His mother's eyes sparkled with relief. The house erupted in celebration. Plans were already being made. Calls were placed. Invitations would go out soon. It should have felt like a victory. It should have been a moment of certainty. But all Ryan felt was an ache in his chest, because while his parents celebrated, his heart refused to rest. Ryan retreated to his study, locking the door behind him. His mind replayed everything from that night: Aisha's fierce independence, her quiet dignity, her painful past. The way she had looked at him, not with admiration, not with expectation, but with something else entirely, something he couldn't place, and that terrified him more than anything, because Ryan Carter had spent his entire life making decisions with logic. But this decision was made with his heart, and he didn't know if he had just made the best choice of his life, or the biggest mistake. The Carter mansion was adorned with golden lights, delicate floral arrangements, and an air of celebration. It was a wedding fit for a billionaire, a grand affair with high-profile guests, extravagant decor, and a ceremony that would be talked about for years. But amidst all the luxury, one person felt like a stranger in his own love story: Ryan Carter. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, he stood at the altar, watching as Aisha walked toward him in a breathtaking white gown. She looked ethereal, like a goddess carved from moonlight. But beneath the beauty, Ryan could see it. The distance, the uncertainty, the quiet resignation in her eyes. She knew he hadn't truly accepted her yet, and that realization cut through him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Aisha had never dreamt of a wedding like this. She had spent years struggling for survival, sleeping on cold pavements, eating whatever scraps she could find. And now, she was wearing a dress worth more than everything she had ever owned in her entire life. But none of it mattered, because the man waiting for her at the altar, the man she was about to vow her life to, did not love her, and she would never beg him to. The officiant's voice echoed through the grand hall. "Do you, Ryan Carter, take Aisha to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Ryan hesitated. Just for a second too long, a second that Aisha noticed. He cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "I do." It was just 2 words, but they felt heavier than any business deal he had ever signed. When it was Aisha's turn, she spoke softly. "I do." No hesitation, no trembling voice, just acceptance. Because unlike Ryan, she had already come to terms with her fate. She did not expect love. She did not expect warmth. She was simply surviving, just as she always had. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Ryan turned to her. Aisha lifted her face slightly, her expression unreadable. This was just for show, for the cameras, for the guests who expected to see passion, not the cold reality of their union. Ryan leaned in. His lips brushed against hers in the softest of touches, just a fraction of a second, but in that moment, something changed. Her lips were warm, her breath was soft, and suddenly Ryan wasn't thinking about the guests, or the cameras, or his parents watching from the front row. For that one fleeting second, all he could feel was her. The reception was extravagant. Guests laughed, champagne flowed, and music filled the air. But Ryan felt like an outsider at his own wedding. Aisha sat beside him at the head table, poised and elegant but distant. She smiled when people spoke to her. She thanked guests for their well wishes. She played her part flawlessly. But when their eyes met, she wasn't really there. "She's stunning," one of Ryan's business associates murmured to him. "She's lucky," another said. Ryan forced a polite smile, but the words grated on him. Was she really the lucky one? She had married a man who didn't love her. She had stepped into a world where she didn't belong. And Ryan, he was starting to wonder if he was the unlucky one. Because no matter how much he tried to ignore it, something inside him ached at the thought of Aisha believing she was unwanted. After hours of formalities, the newlyweds were finally alone. The suite was lavish, with rose petals scattered across the bed and candles flickering in the dim light. A night meant for passion, for new beginnings, for love, but instead there was only silence. Aisha stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Ryan loosened his tie, watching her from across the room. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved closer. Because what was there to say? What was there to do? When love had not yet touched their hearts, when trust had not yet been built. What was left between them? Nothing, yet. But maybe, just maybe, that would change. The days after the wedding were not what Ryan had expected. There was no instant connection, no fairy tale romance, just two strangers, bound by a contract, learning how to exist under the same roof. And yet, something was changing. Mornings in the Carter mansion were silent at first. Ryan would wake up early, expecting Aisha to still be asleep, only to find her sitting by the window, sipping tea, lost in thought. She never complained about her new life, never demanded his attention, never tried to force her way into his heart. She simply existed. And for some reason, Ryan found himself watching her more than he should. It happened at breakfast one morning. Ryan had come downstairs, half distracted by his phone, when he heard it. A soft laugh. Aisha's laugh. It was the first time he had ever heard it. She was sitting with one of the maids, helping her fold napkins, a genuine smile playing on her lips. For a woman who had been forced into this marriage, for a woman who had lived on the streets, how did she still find joy in such small things? Ryan's chest tightened. Something stirred inside him, something he wasn't ready to name. Days turned into weeks. Ryan began noticing things he hadn't before. The way Aisha would stop to help the staff with their work, even though she was now a billionaire's wife. The way she spoke with quiet wisdom, never trying to impress but always leaving an impact. The way she never complained about their cold, distant marriage. She had every reason to resent him, every reason to demand more from him. But she didn't. She simply waited. Not for him to love her, but for him to figure out what he really wanted. One evening, Ryan came home later than usual. It had been a long day, filled with frustrating business meetings, endless calls, and a pounding headache. He expected the house to be silent, expected to see Aisha reading in her room, ignoring his existence like she usually did. But instead, he found her in the kitchen, standing barefoot, making tea, for herself and for him. She glanced up, startled. "You're home late," she said softly. Ryan was too exhausted to reply. Without a word, she handed him a cup of tea. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Carter, billionaire, businessman, a man who never needed anyone, felt something unfamiliar. He felt cared for. Not because of his wealth, not because of his power, but because Aisha was simply Aisha. And that was enough. It wasn't love yet, not fully, but it was something dangerously close. Ryan realized it one afternoon when he walked into the garden and saw Aisha laughing with another man, his best friend, Ethan. Ethan, who was charming. Ethan, who was single. Ethan, who had nothing to lose. Ryan clenched his fists before he even realized he was doing it. It wasn't just the fact that Aisha was smiling. It was the fact that she had never smiled like that. At him. That night, Ryan couldn't sleep. The image of Aisha with Ethan played in his mind, over and over again. Was this what it felt like? To want someone so badly it hurt, to fear losing them before they were even yours? Ryan wasn't a man who hesitated. When he wanted something, he took it. And right now, he wanted her. Not just as his wife in name, not just as a duty to his parents, but as the woman who had unknowingly stolen his heart. The next morning, Ryan made a decision. He walked into the dining room where Aisha was eating breakfast, and for the first time since their wedding, he sat beside her instead of across the table. She blinked, surprised. "Good morning," she said cautiously. Ryan didn't reply. Instead, he picked up her teacup and took a sip. Aisha's eyes widened. "You don't even like tea." "I do now," Ryan said, smirking. Aisha stared at him, and for the first time, he saw it. A flicker of something new in her eyes. Not distrust, not hesitation, but the beginning of hope. And Ryan knew this was just the start. For weeks, Ryan had been falling for Aisha's kindness, her strength, her quiet resilience. But love, real love, was not proven in soft moments or stolen glances. It was tested in fire, and Ryan Carter was about to face the fire. It started with a headline. Aisha woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing non-stop. At first, she ignored it, but when she finally glanced at the screen, her heart stopped. Ryan Carter's wife, a homeless con artist. Her breath caught in her throat. Trembling, she clicked the article. It was filled with half-truths and outright lies. Stories about how she had manipulated Ryan's family into marrying her. Accusations that she had been seen in shady places, implying she had a dark past. And the worst part, a photo of her, taken before the marriage, when she was still homeless, wearing tattered clothes, searching through trash for food. The world was cruel, and now it had turned on her. Ryan was in a morning meeting when his assistant rushed in, looking pale. "Sir, you need to see this." The second he saw the headline, his blood boiled. "How dare they?" He stormed out of the office, ignoring his calls, heading straight home. By the time he arrived, Aisha was sitting in the living room, staring at the article on her phone, her hands clenched in her lap. Her expression wasn't one of shock or anger, it was acceptance. Like she had always known the world would turn against her one day. And that realization shattered something inside Ryan. He sat beside her, his heart pounding. "They'll forget about it in a few days," she said quietly. But Ryan wasn't having it. "Do you really think I'm just going to let this go?" His voice was sharp, filled with an anger he hadn't known he was capable of. Aisha looked at him then, her brown eyes unreadable. "This is what people do, Ryan," she whispered. "They look at someone like me and think I don't belong in your world. And maybe they're right." Ryan's jaw clenched. Number. He wouldn't allow this. She was his wife, his home. And if the world wanted to come after her, they'd have to go through him first. That afternoon, Ryan did something he had never done before. He called a press conference. Journalists flooded into the Carter Enterprises hall, eager for a statement. Speculations ran wild. Would Ryan divorce her to save his image? Would he confirm the rumors? Would he remain silent, letting the world tear her apart? Instead, Ryan walked onto the stage, took the microphone, and shattered every expectation. "I want to make something clear," he said, his voice strong, unwavering. "The woman you're talking about is my wife. The woman you're trying to tear down is the strongest person I've ever known. And if you think I'll stand by while the media tries to ruin her, you don't know me at all." The room fell silent. The cameras flashed, but Ryan wasn't done. "I don't care what lies you spread. I don't care what past she came from. The truth is, she's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And if you think for 1 second that I'll let any of you take that away—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "You're dead wrong." Back at the mansion, Aisha sat by the TV, watching Ryan's press conference unfold in real time. Her fingers trembled as she touched the screen, watching the man who had once been distant, hesitant, now standing up for her like she was the most precious thing in his life. Tears welled in her eyes, because for the first time she realized she wasn't alone anymore. Ryan had chosen her, not because of duty, not because of obligation, but because he loved her. That night, when Ryan returned home, Aisha was waiting for him. He barely had time to speak before she walked up to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," he said firmly. "I should have done it sooner." Aisha exhaled shakily, shaking her head. "I don't want to be your weakness, Ryan." His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "You're not my weakness," he murmured. "You're my strength." And then, for the first time, without hesitation, without fear, he kissed her. Not because the world expected it, not because they were married, but because he needed to, because he loved her. And as Aisha melted into his arms, she knew this love had survived the fire, and now it would never break. For so long, Ryan had believed love had to be a choice, something carefully planned, built on logic, shared between equals. But Aisha had shattered every belief he had ever held. She had challenged him, changed him. And now, as he stood before her, his heart in his hands, he finally understood. Love wasn't about control. It wasn't about status or wealth or perfection. It was about finding someone who made you whole in ways you never expected. And Aisha was that person, his greatest surprise. The night was quiet, the city lights glowing softly outside the Grand Carter estate. Ryan had taken Aisha to the rooftop, a place he often escaped to when life became too loud. But tonight wasn't about escaping. Tonight was about them. As they stood beneath the vast night sky, Ryan gently took her hands in his. She stared up at him, her brown eyes filled with unspoken emotions. "Ryan," she whispered. He silenced her with a soft smile. "I was a fool," he admitted. "A fool to think love could be planned. A fool to resist what was right in front of me." Aisha's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. "I fought this marriage. I fought you. But the truth is, Aisha," he exhaled deeply, his voice trembling with sincerity, "you are the best thing that has ever happened to me." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And I love you," he continued, his voice raw, honest. "Not because my parents wanted this, not because it was arranged, but because you are everything I never knew I needed." Aisha let out a shaky laugh, her tears falling freely now. She had waited for this, waited to hear these words, to know that what they had was real. And now she did. She cupped his face, her thumb tracing his jaw. "You are my greatest surprise too, Ryan," she whispered, "and I wouldn't change a single moment of this journey." Ryan didn't wait another second. He pulled her close, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was deep, tender, and filled with every unspoken promise. Aisha melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as the world faded away. It didn't matter how they started, didn't matter what the world thought. All that mattered was this: them, and the love that had defied every expectation. A year had passed since that night, and life had never been more beautiful. Aisha was no longer just Ryan Carter's wife. She had found her own purpose, launching a charity to help homeless women rebuild their lives, a cause close to her heart. Ryan, once a man who believed only in power and business, now found himself prioritizing home over work. Because home wasn't a mansion. It wasn't wealth. It was Aisha. And every moment with her was a gift. One evening, As they stood on the balcony of their villa, watching the sunset paint the sky in warm hues, Ryan wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "Regret marrying me yet?" he teased. Aisha laughed, leaning back into him. "Not even for a second." And as Ryan held her close, he knew this love, the one he had fought so hard against, had become the greatest love of his life, a love beyond status, beyond expectations, a love that was unbreakable. And with Aisha by his side, he knew he had finally found forever.